hope you managed to find people to talk to you've not met or spoken to before. This next session is really taking a bit of a dive into ethics, which may seem odd, but this particular topic, green finance, blue finance, for many, if you ask them to scrutinize, I've done the exercise in several workshops where you put hopes and fears up onto. Have you done that sort of experience where you put your post-it notes up on a different screen? Hopes, invariably, everybody's got dreams of money that will manifest without too much work. But the fears one is always features some concern about ethics, some concern about, will I get sucked into helping somebody greenwash by accident? How do I have any confidence what's going to happen? And so we thought it right at this stage to pause and take a bit of time to explore that, to hopefully give you some frames of reference, to hopefully give you some things to think about that will give you a bit more confidence. Now there's plenty to think about, and this isn't a silver bullet. But what it does do is gives you hopefully some confidence to navigate that. And Tim said at the beginning, this sort of sense of the Wild West. Well, when heading out to the Wild West, sheriffs also travelled out to the Wild West. We can be those sheriffs that set those standards, that sort of think in those terms about this is what good looks like. The right people doing the right thing in the right place with the right partners that have all got that common sense and understanding. So that's what we're going to take a crack at. To help us kick that off, we're going to try and bring a really important, a very useful piece of work, the nature market principles, to life. And one of those that was part of that journey is going to help us. We'll share what they are, what they mean, how it came together, before we then break down to a panel and get a chance to actually talk through the real life of how to navigate that sort of landscape, the ethical questions that pop up as we start to work with different partners. So, without further ado, if I could welcome to the stage Alicia Gibson, Director of Finance Earth. And Finance Earth were the organisation that sat behind and drew the team together, many contributors looking across the Wildlife Trust in the room with us together that drew this piece of work. So, welcome, Alicia.
Thank you. But we don't need it for now. I'm delighted to be here. Lovely to already have chatted to so many people in this room and be out in beautiful Sussex. To introduce myself, my name's Alicia Gibson. I'm a director at Finance Earth. We are a social enterprise with a mission to mobilise investment into nature. But importantly, actually linked to the title of this whole event, we want to make finance work for nature and climate and communities and avoid the risk that it works the other way around. So I think much of this event is very much linked to our mission and purpose. I don't know how to do the changes in, let's try it, okay. So we've been very fortunate enough to work with the National Parks more recently and National Landscapes Association, as well as many different environmental NGOs, government, private sector organisations, all working together to grow a new market for high integrity investment in nature. So what I wanted to do talk today about was the nature market principles, which we developed and launched last year. And why we did this is the aim was the government launched its nature market framework last year, and the principles were designed to build on the key point in there that integrity is the bedrock of nature markets. So we can't really have these markets and they won't work unless we have really real lasting environmental gains. We don't have greenwashing. We verify outcomes. We prove that they've been delivered. They're really transparent. So that framework came out. But then there wasn't really the guidance in practice of what actually that would mean. All these words like in high integrity and nature markets. How do I actually apply that in practice? So we developed these in partnership. We wanted to align with lots of the work of the NGOs about what they were thinking high integrity were referred to, but also come together around what was practical. So why we did this was the stats that have come out about the need for investment in nature. We've covered that already. There is a real opportunity for credit schemes to bring forward the investment needed to address that gap, where we can't rely on philanthropy and public funding alone. But there is then the risk. So the role of the principles is both helping ensure that high quality projects are developed to build confidence in these markets. So I think trust and confidence is a really, really key feature, and avoid much of the talk around greenwashing that we've seen that actually just completely has the potential to ruin the markets and mean that they never develop in the first place. So aligning around what good looks like is really critical. So these principles, as I said, co-developed with the Wildlife Trust, the National Trust, the RSPB, the Woodland Trust, ourselves from Finance Earth, and Federated Hermes, so bringing that range of perspectives. And they're developed just to fill that short-term void, build on other principles. So it wasn't that they were independent and couldn't work alongside other principles that you would have heard of, but they aim to influence market practice, actually inform policy. So some of you may be aware of the BSI standards that have since been developed. Some of this was informing that going forward, and build on all the existing work. And what we developed was 9 principles, 7 on the supply side, which really refers to what a good project should look like, and then 2 on the demand side, which refers to what a good buyer should look like. So by having the supply side and demand side, hopefully you then grow this high integrity nature market. So diving into detail, I wanted to share a bit more, given that we said that the principles really are to provide more practical guidance on what good looks like. Sort of, I don't actually know who's in the room, but if we have landowners or project developers, how could you take these forward when you're designing and planning your own projects, and even thinking as buyers about the types of projects you might engage with? So talking through these principles in turn, the first one, really important one, around science-based nature recovery. Just checking the presentation, because I knew on previous ones it wasn't working. So what we mean by that, again, it's been covered a lot already, which is great. I think a lot of what's already been shared is sort of the principles are being applied already. But looking at delivering nature aligned to local priorities, targets, the right tree in the right place, local nature recovery strategies, thinking about connectivity and resilience in the project design, and ensuring that overall uplift is delivered through your project. Number 2 focuses on environmental and social safeguards. This really focuses on where considering the overall impact of your project on the wider environment and other stakeholders as part of your project design. So importantly here, you'll often hear the term around considering leakage and any mitigating measures. So by that, it's really by delivering your nature recovery project, is that leading to displacement of other activities elsewhere? So making sure you really assess the impact of your project more broadly beyond the overall outcomes in the place that you're delivering it. Number 3, additionality. That word comes up a lot. I'm sure there's awareness here. As I said, it does build on wider principles already. So making sure you have no legal obligation to deliver your nature project. And the project wouldn't have happened anyway unless you were able to engage in these markets and sell your ecosystem services. So really making sure that you have clear baselines established and can prove the additionality of your outcomes. Permanence, number 4, really, we this one sort of was quite a, what does permanence mean? Are we talking about forever? Is that realistic? So the balance, but maximizing durability. Can we deliver these outcomes for as long as possible? Ideally into perpetuity, but we do need to also make them practical on the ground. So key to this is making sure a contractual agreement is in place for delivery of your project over the lifetime, the relevant project lifetime. So you've committed to deliver the outcomes, and you really mitigate any risk of reversals. Financial prudence is, I think, a one that we really focus and encourage on. It's not often covered, but definitely has been covered already today. And that's about making sure you have sufficient money to cover the costs of your project over it and deliver the benefits that you've forecasted over the lifetime. And so in the early stages of the nature markets, it's often about, can we sell our credits as quickly as possible to bring in that money and not think about the future? So we really encourage actually looking at selling your units or credits when the outcomes are delivered. So over time, so that you're matching your costs with your income and you have more certainty about the overall costs over the lifetime as the benefits are delivered, and you can sort of manage and change and adapt as you see fit. But if you can't do that, because you also do need your money up front as well, just making sure that you have mitigation measures in place. So things like putting aside cash to cover future costs and not just using it all up at the time. Still going. And then co-benefits, thinking about how communities can benefit. Could you benefit share? Are you engaging with them in the design? Verifiability, looking at trusted third-party accreditation, and transparency around commitment to disclosure of both positive and negative outcomes. We're in the early stage of this market. We need to learn from successes and failures. So that's the supply side. Demand side, there is less. There is 2 demand side principles, but they do cover some really important things around both screening criteria, getting the evidence of buyer commitments to the mitigation hierarchy. That's come up a lot already, and the commitments made to both carbon and biodiversity reductions before you engage in credit markets. So to only engage in those transactions if you can get evidence from the buyer and have put in place enhanced screening if there's particularly damaging sectors. So be cautious there. On commitment to best practice, this is focused around broader commitments that could be made. So again, reporting aligned to TNFD, love that. Don't work with them unless they commit to that, so keep pushing that. Broader than that, adherence to international labour standards and transparency on disclosures and commitments and how you're working. So these are the principles in a nutshell. There is further detail, but they are meant to be just quite easy to grab hold of and work with. But what's the role of this, and sort of what's the relevance of it actually to national parks and protected landscapes? So I see that these principles can be adopted and taken on really by anyone looking to develop high integrity projects. They also could be adapted. So even when we were developing this, we see them as the minimum criteria, very aware that even the organizations involved have their own criteria, and we encourage you to go above and beyond the principles. But the role is as well, you could take them and provide sort of more granular checklists about a tool to develop high quality projects. Hopefully this can really create these high integrity markets, showcasing what poor practice might look like, encourage that prudence that I referred to. So, managing your income and your delivering your benefits, whilst also providing greater assurance to get that demand coming through. I think, as Helen said, we're getting good at this supply. We're aware of what good looks like, but still thinking about buyers not being able to sort of see this market as too much of a risk. And actually, if we have consistency over what credible high quality looks like, they have less of an excuse to say it's too risky to engage and we can't go anywhere near these kinds of markets. And help you also to identify what an approved buyer should look like. Who should you be working with? Build up your checklist using the principles here. So what now? We can move on to the discussion. But as I said, these principles were created last year, really, when there was quite a void in what good might look like, to provide that practical guidance on developing projects. You may be aware that in March, the British Standards Institute launched their BSI Flex Nature Markets Principles and Standards. These are currently out for consultation until the 7th of June, so there's time to feed into that. They involve many more stakeholders and experts and are intended for a broader audience. They are quite detailed and granular. So I still see these principles as providing that simplified overview, practical guidance that you can really kind of take forward in your own strategies and policies. And I've seen already that even the South Downs and your Habitat Bank guidelines and checklists that are very much aligned. So if you're aligning with BSI or these principles, there are similarities, and the consistency is definitely an important part. So that's hopefully gives you a bit of an overview to some of this. Look forward to answering any questions and taking forward the discussion on ethics.
Now's the moment. There we go. We'll if you want to grab a seat, thank you ever so much for that. And did exactly what we hoped, which was to share a frame of reference. It's a set of principles. It's not a you must. It's how do you think about and how do you consider each of these in your thought process. To help us unpick this a little further, if I can invite Jess to the stage, and please grab a chair as you come on up. First to join us is Dr. Rob Stoneman, the Director of Landscapes Strategy for the Wildlife Trust. If you want to come on up. And just whilst Rob is joining us, can I also invite Matthew Woodcock, MBE, Partnerships and Enterprise Manager, South East for the Forestry Commission. And last but not least, to bring a perspective from the commercial lens, Ollie Breen, Sustainability and Responsibility Banking Senior Manager at Santander. Right, as we're all getting comfy. So you're in the hot seats. This is kind of, I suppose, a very live topic, and we've got. When I come to you, please do grab those microphones, lift them out, and run with it. Ethics is a really emotive topic in this space, and there's been protests and whatever else. And I suppose just before we kick off, I'd really be interested in, Lisa, you've had a chance to sort of give a flavour for why you got involved and why this is important to you. But I suppose I'll just come to each of you in turn. Rob, do you want to kick us off and give us a sense of why is this important? Why is this something that you think needs discussion?
Yeah, okay. So, a couple of things really. So, I mean, firstly, it's really important that the sector doesn't engage in greenwashing, because greenwashing does two things. A, it's a lie, so it's just bad, very bad practice, but it also kills the sector. And, you've seen that in the international carbon market. So, where you've had some really dodgy carbon companies working, what that's done is depressed what is still a fairly nascent market, and so it's a really bad start when you're doing that. So it's really important that we advocate to avoid greenwashing. So we need to provide surety in the marketplace so that buyers are buying something that's real. That's a completely reasonable thing to do. The second thing for us as wildlife trusts is that we really need to avoid greenwashing, because our brand is everything to us. Our brand is incredibly well trusted. If we look at a charity index of brands, it's up there right at the top. And, so if we start to sell things like carbon offsets or biodiversity net gain credits, which we are doing, we've got to protect our brand. So we need a set of principles that we can then turn into practical guidelines. And so, for example, for biodiversity net gain, we have some high-level principles that we advocate to government. We don't think government's gone far enough, actually. And then we turn that into a set of very practical guidelines that we can then use in terms of our own delivery.
Fabulous. And we'll just sit with you for a moment. And you're one of the collaborators in the piece of work we've just talked about. So I'm assuming, to connect the dots, that those motives were what led you to want to be part of that and sort of take that forward at a combined level.
Yeah, absolutely, because we're working very closely with Finance Earth on the UK Nature Fund, am I allowed to call it that now? Whatever. UK Nature something, which is a massive private sector investment into nature restoration, which is fabulous. Obviously, we need to make sure I mean, that needs to be A, profitable to the investors, and B, real. It actually makes a difference. And these principles are about making sure that it's real.
Fab. And if I could turn to Matthew, you're coming at this from a slightly different lens, I guess. But I guess why is this important to you, coming from that public sector, sort of large landholder perspective?
Well, I'll stick to the public sector as the regulator. I've had 40 years where I've had the opportunity to encourage and champion the role that trees and woodlands can play in the future, and that's getting stronger and stronger. So loads of people are interested in woodlands and what trees can do. But without that credibility and that information behind that's secure, people will have different opinions. And as the regulator, I'm often in the middle of trying to find what is the right thing in the right place and demonstrate to people that may have different perspectives and saying, oh, well, we love the idea of the right tree in the right place, but does it have to be there? I think it might be better over there. And having that credibility of that information about carbon, which I think we've got a very robust system with the Woodland Carbon Code, which is continually being refined as we build up more knowledge. We need to build more knowledge about the carbon in the soil as well as the carbon under the ground, so that it is being compared apples with apples rather than apples with pears. And how we engage, I don't like the word sell, we engage the wider public in the wider environment as well. So I think we've got a fantastic time, but without that underpinning facts that we can put our hand on our heart and justify, we will struggle.
Fab, thanks. And there is a second microphone so we can share them about. I'll turn to Ollie, and you bring, well, I hinted at it when you came up, a commercial lens. You're on that demand side. Can you give us a flavour of why this is important to you, why you've accepted the invite to come and join us today?
I'll start with the latter then. So Santander partnered with National Parks in 2021, and our relationship to date's been on two specific schemes, one in the Cairngorms and one in the Lake District. But I guess, why do we care? And Helen touched on it in the last presentation. As an industry, we're being increasingly expected to measure, to disclose the impact that we have through our lending. And once we start disclosing and measuring that, the next natural step is we need to find credible ways of mitigating that impact that we have. And removing carbon, removing biodiversity impact is a very long scheme, a very long time. So we need something in the interim while we execute on those strategies to minimise the impact. And from a banking perspective, we can't go near anything unless it's credible. We can't go near anything. Tim mentioned at the very start, it has to be trusted. And that's why these sort of principles are key to us, because we need the surety that when we're investing in a scheme, when we're looking at that as part of our wider strategy, it's credible, it's permanent, it's going to do what it says it does. Because we're very public and we are a target. If we do the wrong thing, even with the right intentions, we will know about it, and we'll know about it very quickly.
So you mentioned public, which immediately reminded me, you've got shareholders, you've got hundreds of thousands of customers. Where on the world does this feature for your shareholders, your customers? Is this important, or a by the by, or just a box to tick?
Santander is a global bank. I think you'll get various flavours of that depending on the countries we operate in. We've got massive presence in Latin America. What we are increasingly seeing is that the UK is incredibly vocal about this. The sort of feedback we get from activists, the feedback we get from investors and shareholders is massively being led in the UK. And they don't care what our UK footprint is. They care about our global footprint. And that's one of the things we're really keen on is when we started this journey, all of our work was done globally. We looked at global schemes. We looked at Amazon. We looked across the world. We had nothing in the UK. And what we've really seen over the last few years is that increasing quality of UK schemes, that increasing quality of trust behind that, is driving investment into the UK rather than into other schemes that we could access globally.
So from all that, I take it that it features on those discussions at the board. It features in feedback from the customers. It's important to them as well as the sort of bank itself. Yeah,
internally, delivery of our climate strategy is linked to, within the UK, every employee's remuneration. It is one of the few things that drives what we do as a bank at the moment.
Fab. Thanks. So greenwash was mentioned straight away. So let's start there and build on that. And I guess the ambition today is to try and equip this community of practice that's emerging to try and take their next step in their adventure. And I guess I'm looking for some sort of insights. So, how would you, perhaps Alicia, we'll start with you. How would you start? Well, a couple of key things you just draw attention to. That's the word that's in front of you. You're nervous about it. What would the immediate top tips be to sort of have in your mind?
So I think it's always really useful to learn from others as well. So I think when I started out in this, the market was entirely new. So don't be afraid. Don't feel like you have to do it alone. I find actually going through the steps from, not rushing ahead of yourself and going straight to the buyers, but actually looking at your project that you have, what can be delivered, how does it fit into the local strategies, what does the Wildlife Trust think about it, is there real benefits that can be delivered, what should take place. So start with nature and don't, before the markets, don't let the markets run, let nature run, and choose the right thing first. And then look to work out what the benefits, who the buyers are, and the opportunities to sell, and whether you really can kind of cover the cost. So I definitely think it's kind of working through that journey. I'd probably suggest actually the journey we worked through in the early days luckily got sort of turned into a beautiful worm by GFI, and actually I love using their worm, which is a toolkit on kind of going through the steps. And then that screening and kind of who are the buyers that you'd work with and putting all those principles in place, I do think actually is a good way to just not rush ahead of yourself.
Fab. And thinking of that, I'm going to jump on to Rob and ask, because you've just recently take your steer from that sort of screening. You've done some work with some institutional investors, some big. And how did you approach that? And I guess what was the thought process to help manage? And I guess a phrase we might all come back to quite regularly is managing risk in this process.
Yeah, so a good example is we have a relationship with Aviva. So we are delivering part of their nature-based solutions program that they have. So they have donated to the Wildlife Trust £40 million, so it's a really significant amount of money, to establish new temperate rainforest nature reserves. Now, before we actually that's a really interesting agreement. It runs till 2082. Which is says something about permanence, and there's very few institutions that could sign a contract that runs to 2082. So Wildlife Trust can do that because we know we'll still be around in 2082. And Aviva will probably still be around, I hope so, because I've got my pension in 2082. So there's very few relationships where you'd get that. And that's important in terms of one of those principles about permanence. The second thing for us, of course, is looking at because that's a carbon deal, so looking at their net zero trajectory and really examining that. And we spent about a year looking at their net zero strategy, really questioning them very hard about that. Now, of course, their leadership might change. It's a strategy, and strategies can change, et cetera, et cetera. But on the face of it, they look like they've got a very credible strategy for net zero. And the thing that we liked about it most was that the nature-based solutions that they're investing in today is to offset carbon in the 2040s. And that makes sense, because if we're planting trees today, they're not going to be they don't really get motoring for about 20, 30 years. In the 2040s, those trees will be pulling in a lot of carbon, and then, of course, it will tail off in the 2100s. So taking a very long-term view, and I think that was really good. And actually, the way that Aviva put it, and I suppose they would, their insurance company, is what they're trying to do is insure themselves today against carbon emissions in the 2040s, which they hope they don't need to use. So they hope that this whole program will be a white elephant by then, because actually technically they'll have got to zero without the nature-based solutions. But when you start looking at construction and aviation, it's actually quite difficult to work out how.
And so to convert that into a couple of tips, it felt like take your time, do your due diligence, get to know the partner.
Yeah, and I mean due diligence in many different ways, because it's I mean when we first started talking to Aviva on that program, the risk, their lawyers had come up with a contract which put all the risk on us, and we said, but you're buying the carbon, not us. The risk should sit with you. So we've completely reversed that contract so that all of the risk sits with Aviva, and that's quite right, because they're the investor, not us. We're the provider. But what we've put in a whole load of safeguards in how you mitigate that risk. So, for example, the sorts of woodlands that we're planting in those western areas, we know it will become drier and wetter in the winter and dry in the summer. So we're looking at very high diversity of species mixes in order to protect ourselves against that. And I think, in my mind, really, that the trees that we plant is really the nurse crop for the future rainforest, not the rainforest itself. It's to allow that to be created. Again, we can take an extremely long-term view on that.
So that long-term view. So that's another set of tips. And so as we, I'll just work our way along, and I will break the pattern in a moment. But Matthew, coming back to that greenwash, and any particular tips or things in your mind, in your realm.
So I'm going to turn it on its head a little bit. And we touched on the principle of engaging the finance. And in many ways, we're all saying, well, they've got the money, so they'll give us the money, and we'll tell them we're doing some super stuff. But if we really engage them, we'll get much more from them. And by that I mean, let's find the best options for the land. Look what the land can deliver in a multifunctional way. So not look at it just for trees. So if we're going to talk to a landowner and we're talking about what their opportunities might be to seek other finance, let's go together as a joined up community to try and identify what the best opportunities are for that land, which meet that landowner's aspirations, because they're the ones that are going to be there in the long term, and then also engage the chief executives and the wider team. So I've had 2 occasions over the years where I've had to do that, or had the opportunity to do that. One was with a certain airport around Heathrow, where their executives were putting in a new heating system, and they were worried about, is the wood supplied from the southeast sustainable? And we literally took their chief executives out to the woods with the person that was facilitating the supply chain. And I've got photos and video of them in Armani suits planting the trees for the next generation. They're engaged. It means something then if they're engaged. And another occasion in terms of the local enterprise partnerships, which are now defunct, but were writing plans about 10 years ago. Berkshire LEP had zip reference the environment in it. Absolutely nothing. And then a few years later, we were talking to John Lewis Partnership, and their consultant was saying, we want the green, because it allows us to attract and retain the high quality staff. Our staff, as well as our investors, want this, and they want the opportunities to get involved. So if we're going for a truly sustainable and joined up and financed future, we need everybody to understand that. I'll leave it at that.
Well, fab, thanks. And so, anything to add? Okay.
I mean, I think from a greenwashing perspective, we've covered loads. I think it comes down to, is it credible? Is it believable? I think the simplest way anyone explained it to me was, it's about doing what you say. And if you are doing what you're saying, you probably mitigate most of the greenwashing risk. I think the one bit to add in, and it's not just about environment, and it's what I love about the principles, are when we look at something, we look at the environmental claims, but it's also about the social impact. And we could invest in schemes that are brilliant for the environment, but if they're damaging for local communities, if they're damaging for local industry, that exposes us to risk, because that exposes us to social washing rather than greenwashing. And I think that's a really key aspect to go alongside the environmental piece.
Yeah, and that, it's useful to bring these things, because we're having a conversation and mostly we're talking about biodiversity, but actually we've got a little reference to climate, we've got a reference to, the reality is we operate in quite a mucky space. It's not as clean and tidy, and you're having to think across all of those different dimensions at the same time. I'm interested in some tools to help us, because a lot of what we've talked about is how to validate, how to be confident in different things. And I wonder if amongst you there might be any tools or codes, perhaps as a hint, that you might want to draw attention to that are useful reference points in these journeys. And I know that they're at different stages in their journey, but anybody want to kick me off?
What was the question? So, tools?
Yeah, tools to work with. So these points of reference. So we're looking to validate standards. What's out there that might help us do that?
I do think it is worth. I mean, a lot of people talk about this market as the Wild West. I don't really like it being talked like that, because again, I think it damages the whole market itself. But looking at these established frameworks that have been approved by multiple stakeholders and government that really are trusted, so working with the codes and standards, I think there has been an issue that they do just look at project delivery and quality, and they don't play a role in the buyer side. And so that actually in the UK, I think, where some of the principles came through, that the buyer side was actually missing. But on the supply side, working with those trusted frameworks, but actually, again, they missed out often the community and social impact. So going above and beyond those, but don't go below those. And then there's obviously been new standards that come out, sort of like the approaches Wilder Carbon were looking at around looking at the demand and supply side. So they've got some good guidance on the demand side, which I think is worth looking at. So I think established codes and standards is a good place to start. But we also do need to be innovators and pioneers. So I think we always say we need to work with the established, but otherwise we wouldn't make progress. BNG isn't going to solve everything, so we have to create new markets, which means we can't always work with established codes and frameworks. So there is a balance. Just make sure you're not over-claiming, basically. If you're setting up a new scheme and you've got a buyer funding it, just make sure they're funding that pathway to create something and not claiming something that actually hasn't been proven and verified.
Yeah, and I'll give you a bit of a problem. I guess I know it's climate change and carbon linked, but Rob, you were part of sort of pulling together some of the peatland codes, and I guess again it's that insight to why did you do it, but what's the use once they're established? How does it help us navigate this sort of ethical space?
Yeah, so I chaired the peatland code executive and helped develop that whole programme over many years. And I would say, actually, we're doing a piece of work now with the Scottish Government and with the Woodland Carbon Code as well, to extend Woodland Carbon Code and Peatland Code as a bundled biodiversity and carbon scheme. So that's going to be a really interesting update to the code. I don't know when it'll come out, probably next year, sometime in version 3, I think. So that's really interesting. But I mean, in terms of the origin of all of that, if we go right back, we were saying, well, if we look at the amount of peatland in this country, one of the richest countries in the world in terms of our peatland resource, I think although we're a very small nation area-wise, we have the 15th largest area of peatland in the world, so we're really important. And we have we're one of our crown dependencies, Falkland Islands, also full of peatlands as well. So, we've got some really interesting role in that. And they're all damaged. So that's the really catastrophic thing. We've managed to, our biggest semi-natural habitat in the UK, we've managed to damage the lot, all of it. There's none of it in any good condition. And the cost of restoring that, and we must restore that, it's an enormously dense, important carbon store, enormously important in terms of biodiversity, water quality, water regulation, and so on. The cost of it is huge, and there just isn't enough money public money available to do that. So we were looking at, what are the private mechanisms to do that, and obviously that then started to lead to the development of the Peatland Code. And the Peatland Code is exactly as Alicia said, it's just a surety system, and in the end, it's just about saying if you buy this carbon, you're buying something that's real. Now, behind that is a huge amount of complexity, and I spend a lot of time arguing with my colleagues at CEH and others, the academics, who put in place these vastly impractical academic exercises in showing what surety looks like, and I sit there and go, well, that will never work, and we make that into a much more practical system. But that's what the codes are for. That's really important. Now, a standard like the code, like the Peatland Code and the Woodland Carbon, they are just a standard. They're not a trade. They're just a standard. Obviously, then whoever's trading, I think they should also then go much above that and start to talk about, well, what are the ethics of trading here? And the ethics of trading includes things like social acceptability. So, for example, we use the Woodland Carbon Code in our Aviva project. That Woodland Carbon Code doesn't mean we have to do social consultation, all that kind of. You could just use it. But of course, with the Wildlife Trust, of course we do that. So the very first thing we would do if we started a nature reserve is talk to the local community. Even before we bought the land, the very first thing we would do is talk to local people, see what they think about it. Of course, most people love the idea of a nature reserve on their doorstep, so it's not a particularly complicated process for us. But nevertheless, they're going to come up with a whole load of stuff that we wouldn't have thought about, and then we can work that into the scheme.
So a couple of points that sort of come from that. So there's these points of reference, and okay, we talked, that particular example was sort of carbon-centric, but this should apply, looking for those points of reference to give you that confidence of the credit. but then the layers that go with it, how you engage to sort of add the extra value. So, fab. You're not on, so I've gravitated to sort of the supply side, but the demand side, there are some frameworks out there to sort of help illustrate your credentials, I guess, and so whether it's UNF, CCC, Race to Zero, or other validated things that give a sense of those things. And again, that's carbon, but anything you would add from that sort of lens of how you hold yourselves to account about your commitments, journeys, reference points you might encourage those who are about to work with you to think about?
And I think it's very relevant if you're looking at the credibility of the buyers that are coming to you, and certainly as a bank, and it's fairly well established now, when you're looking at their commitments to net zero, there are frameworks like the Science Based Targets Initiative, which really give you comfort around how credible or otherwise their ambitions are. Transition planning, which is a massive area of varying quality. There's a lot of good guides from the Transition Plan Task Force around what a good quality transition plan might look like. So some evolving areas there. And I think just from the buyer side, but a little bit of bringing it to life of the value of the codes, particularly the Woodland Code and Peatland Code. When we went to our parent entity and wanted to invest in the national park schemes, the first answer was no. And the only way we got an answer yes was because we could show that there were government-backed codes that were credible. Our head office is in Madrid. They were very familiar with the Spanish codes, the European codes. We had to take them on an education process for the UK codes. And without that, there would be no Santander investment because we wouldn't have got approval for it.
And we have deliberately touched a little bit on the carbon ones because to some extent I think that they feel more mature. They've had round 3 coming up on the peatland. I think the comment was made earlier by Helen that we need to see this happen across other parts, so the biodiversity to the same as well. You're going to shift attention a little and think about scale. So the second principle is about thinking big and systems wide, and it was referenced right at the beginning in the first note about, a hectare here and there can ultimately make a difference, but actually to start to sort of drive pace to sort of accelerate. And I'm thinking of the forestry question. I wonder, Matthew, is there anything you would observe around that working at scale, that sort of bringing that second principle to life about looking for the systems-wide benefits?
So I think a lot of my time has been in southeast England, so sometimes getting that scale in terms of hectares in one place hasn't happened until recently, but it has started to happen now. One of the things, I would also use the word significance in terms of biodiversity. So if we're looking to compensate, shall we say, for something, and we sometimes talk about ratios, should we create X hectares of woodland to replace 1 hectare of woodland? That's not a good measure in many respects, because a hectare of woodland in the middle of nowhere isn't going to deliver a lot of biodiversity benefit. A hectare of woodland that links existing woodlands, or buffers existing woodlands, or links other things, can be hugely beneficial. So we tested this 25 years ago. We were looking at the ancient Lincolnshire lime woods, and we asked a gentleman called George Peterkin, who was Natural England's biodiversity specialist at the time, should we recreate the woodlands that were there in Doomsday, or should we do something else? And he said, do something else. Look for the links, look for the biodiversity network as a whole. So yes, it is fantastic to see a big proposal come in, but those big proposals, I will sometimes and very regularly identify other things that might be better on parts of that site. So I'll be talking to my colleagues in Natural England, increasingly to the Environment Agency, and saying, actually, is there something we can do as an integrated habitat approach on this? Big is great, but given the nature of land holding, particularly in southeast England, we need to be grasping all opportunities. And I would give you one thing, I call it having a strategic vision but an entrepreneurial approach. And this is where you're thinking big, but you're trying to draw interest and not getting too bogged down in we must have that particular thing in that particular place. Grab the owners that are interested, grab the support that's interested, but have a long vision about what you want.
Fab. Sadly, time's going to defeat us, but before, just to sort of the last one, I don't know if I'm saving the most difficult question to the end, and I'll see who wants to join. of course, it would be wonderful for all of those that we develop a project, we turn to the market, and the people who come forward have got an unblemished history. They're perfect. They've never put a foot wrong. The reality is I can't think of very many companies short of a startup, and even then you could probably track it back through the directors, that would ever meet that brief. So what's the thoughts about dealing with the past, about all companies which many of which will have degraded nature, will have done something against it? What's the thoughts about how to deal with them? Because I suppose if we are to try and unlock the quickest, the most rapid change for our environment, we shouldn't ostracise all of them. In fact, if we did, we'd probably have no market left at all. So just any thoughts on that as our closing question? And anyone want to go first? You've got the microphone. Go for it.
Joy of actually working with Rob and his team when we were looking at setting up our fund and partnering with them, and going through your due diligence process of any corporate partners and the type of work. It was like, actually, a thing that hasn't been covered, due diligencing them like you due diligence a company, doing Google research of any negative articles and looking back at what they funded. And it was incredible to pull out all of this sort of stuff that has happened. And I think really showcasing to that company that you are finding this stuff, because they can really put forward all of their amazing things they're doing, but doing it further and going further and saying, we found stuff on you, but what are you going to come back at that? And then how are we mitigating that going forward? So we can't fully look back, but again, is there a transition plan? Is it credible? Does it align with targets? Has it been signed off and approved, independently verified? So I think we have to look forward, but not be afraid to make sure that we point out things that are kind of being hidden by anyone, because no one wants to showcase that they're looking bad. So that's just a small thing.
I would just add to that and say we've got to be a little bit cautious with that, because some of the things that we might not feel appropriate now were being encouraged many years ago. And you could alienate a lot of the people who want to do the right thing and are credible in the way they've suggested forward, if you looked at everything that's been done in history.
Yeah, and so I think that's true for many. I know in a number of sort of approaches to this, a clear and public apology, a demonstrable change to action that's happened afterwards, those things provide the evidence to say, well, that was, a line has been drawn and we can see the evidence. Is that...
Well, I'm not sure you need to apologise. You need to just do stuff. I mean, I think it picks up on what Helen was talking about earlier. You know, it's about having a systems change. You know, so for example, we as a Wildlife Trust will not work with oil and gas companies anymore. They're just far too damaging. But I would work with an oil and gas company that has a credible strategy to turn itself into a renewable energy company. Absolutely, that would be fine. I don't know of any that does that, but we would do it.
They have called themselves energy companies, though, so they are drifting in there.
We know that the biggest driver of wildlife decline in this country is due to agriculture. And we work with farmers day in, day out. I'm very happy to work with farmers, and I'm certainly not blaming individual farmers. I do blame the system and current agricultural policy and so on. So, you know, we absolutely will work with people that have damaged wildlife, but they must prove that they're on a journey that's going to make a big difference. So I think this due diligence of companies is really important in terms of who we would work with. And actually the best partnerships are the partnerships where you're on a journey together, where actually the transaction is quite a minor part of the process. The really important process is the journey that you're going on to. And certainly from our perspective in the Wildlife Trust, we're now trying to move away from a transactional partnerships with corporates to a much more partnership-based approach, where we're saying, look, if we work together, we are now on a journey together to a more sustainable future.
Fabulous. And at that point, I'm going to sadly have to draw this to a close, because one of my main jobs is to try and stick to time, and I'm close. If I could just ask everybody to a big round of applause and thanks to our panel, Alicia, Rob, Matthew and Ollie. That brings the morning sessions to a close. We're going to go into lunch now. if you haven't had a chance to look in your pack for your menu. Have a look through that. There's some amazing food that in there. I need to direct you to where to go because it's not in here. We will be leaving out of the door, heading out back to the car park, turn right, go to the right-hand edge of the main building and head for the garden at the back. You'll see a couple of marquees. You'll see an outdoor fire pit. I mean, sort of fabulous food. I look forward to seeing you over there, and we'll be back in here in an hour's time. Have fun.